Hello, everyone. I want to just welcome everyone I'm seeing after so long in our beautiful sanctuary. And your book is, I have to admit, painful to read for so many reasons, but also beautifully written. And so I want to just start with how fast you wrote it. It seemed almost, I don't want to call it therapeutic, but it certainly, or maybe it felt in some ways that there was no choice but to sit down and put it down. But why did you decide to write it after probably one of the hardest moments imaginable?
Great. Am I on there?
You are.
Good. Thank you, Abby. I'm very honored to be here in the Vatican of Reform Judaism. And I've heard a lot about this remarkable space and this amazing congregation, so I'm honored and delighted to be with everybody. And Abby, what an honor it is to be interviewed by you, at least so far. So,
just wait.
Yeah. Well, the book was written in basically 5 months or 6 months. It was sort of an act of profound insomnia. I mean, I was up through the nights anyway, and I wasn't sleeping after we lost Tommy. And, you know, it just gets too late. You can't even call people on the West Coast when it's like 3 or 4, you know? So I started to just bear down, and I wrote it essentially as a love letter to our lost son. My wife, Sarah, is here tonight, along with a bunch of family, including my brother-in-law, Kenneth, my sister-in-law, Abby, and Carol, and my mother-in-law, I think, I'm not sure if she's here, but Toba's here. So I've got a bunch of family here. But the book, it started as a love letter to Tommy, and then it became also a love letter to America, to my country. And so it was quite cathartic to write it, I would say. I did read the audio book into the microphone, and that was a pretty wrenching process, I gotta say.
The title is Unthinkable, for anybody who doesn't have it, and it is quite a bestseller and has been beautifully reviewed. Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. You know, we talk, since we're in synagogue, every word in the Torah is deliberate. So why the word unthinkable? How did you decide that was the right?
Well, Sarah actually called to me when she was reading the book, and she said, "I know what the title of your book is." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Unthinkable." And I said, "You know, why?" And she said, "It's all throughout your book." And it was, and it's not a word that I think I used much before we lost Tommy on the last day of 2020 and before, you know, the insurrection of January 6th. But we went back, we did a word search, and it appeared something like 17 or 18 times. And at the end of the book, you know, I mean, so it refers to the loss of our beautiful, dazzling son, because it's unthinkable to live in a world without him. It refers to what happened on January 6th, because a coup and an insurrection in the United States also is something that would have been considered unfathomable until it happened. But then also I ended up using the word to refer to what Tommy's dreams were for what life could be like, because he was a young man of exceptional moral and political passion, and he hated war, he hated fascist aggression, the kind we're seeing coincidentally today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he felt very deeply the suffering of human beings and violations of people's human rights, and also the suffering of other sentient beings too. He was a passionate vegan, and he wasn't a guilt-tripping vegan, but he was a passionate vegan. And if you asked him, like, well, why are you a vegan? He'd written several poems about it, and he would get up and he would just deliver one of his poems to you, and then he converted a lot of people to veganism when they listened to his poetry.
What was one of the joke he said about the dog being sentient? Or?
Oh, whenever he pet Toby or Potter, our dogs, he would say, Toby, you're a very fine sentient being. That was...
And where did you see that compassion come from? Was that just from the word go as a little boy?
Yeah, he was born with just an extraordinary empathic sense, really exceptional, and people could see it. He always saw things through the eyes of the underdog. For that reason, he had a very profound libertarian tendencies. I have this striking memory of walking him to school when he was a little boy. I think it was 3rd or 4th grade, and one of his classmates had been suspended for writing some bad words on the blackboard, and they'd made him, stay home for a week. And we were walking to school, and then the boy was being walked by his mom to school. And I said, look, there's Joey. They let him out of jail. And Tommy said, no, you mean they let him back into jail. So he had a pretty profound anti-authoritarian sensibility to him, which was pretty cool. He believed in freedom, and he really wanted freedom for everybody. And he was a skeptic of state power and bureaucratic power and corporate power, and he was really something.
It really, obviously every Jewish parent is proud of their children, but he really does come through as quite extraordinary. You describe him as having a perfect heart, and I'd just love you to expand a little bit on what you meant by that.
Well, yeah, I tell some stories in the book of things that I would say where Tommy would gently correct me, because he always saw things from other people's perspectives. I tell the story that one of the very charming young women who he dated came over, and then I asked what they were going to do, and then Tommy said, well, I think we're going to play a game of chess. And she said, yeah, chess is a fun game. And I said, a fun game? Chess is, Tommy had a T-shirt when he was a little boy that said, chess is life, chess is, and I was just kidding with her. And in fact, I knew her to be a big fan of Shakespeare. And I said, that's like saying Shakespeare's a good writer, And, but Tommy kind of castigated me later. He said, that might make sense for somebody who's played a lot of chess and spent a lot of time with chess. It doesn't make sense to somebody who's just starting out. And you shouldn't act like chess is like the be-all and the end-all of everything. And so I felt kind of sheepish and like 2 cents at that point, because he was right. But he saw things from, if he read an article about what was happening in Ukraine today, like all of us, I think he'd be crestfallen and very moved, but he would be immediately moved to action, like, okay, what can we do? What are the groups that are helping over there? How can we raise money to get money to go over there? He felt it like it was happening to people in our family. And that's true whether Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Yemeni civil war, and the Saudi attack on Yemen, or earthquake in Haiti, whatever it might be, he felt it like that, like it was something that needed to be done right now. And I think ultimately he was overwhelmed with feeling about the pain of the world.
And what was striking is that coupled with the empathy was the comedy that runs through all of your chapters about him, was how funny he was, how much you laughed together.
Yes.
And that could be seen as a contradiction. How did they sort of intersect?
Well,
I think,
if you talk to people in our family, everybody would tell you he was extremely funny. When my family would go away on vacations, there are a bunch of little kids, and so there would be these stand-up comedy competitions, because everything is a competition in my family. But he would always win he would win the stand-up comedy night, But from the time of being a little boy, he was profoundly philosophical, and he would say to Sarah and me, like if we were at the beach, like, do you want to have a debate about free will and determinism? And he was like 8 years old, and so we would debate free will and determinism. That became like a running debate because he was a very big believer in determinism, and he pretty much ended every debate by saying, I freely choose to believe that everything is determined. And then I would say, well, it's determined that I take the position of free will. I've got no choice. But he wrote about philosophy like it mattered, and he wrote about the trolley problem in a way that was really profound, and I write about that in the book. The question that they pose to philosophy students, well, if there's a trolley that's about to, kill 100 people, and it's going down a track, and you have the opportunity to switch the tracks, but it's going to kill one person, but you're doing that deliberately, what do? Do you let the train go along the track it's on, or do you switch? And of course, it's an unsolvable ethical dilemma. But what Tommy did with it was he wrote an essay where he said, well, this plays on our sense that letting 100 people die is something like deliberately killing one person, and that's why it's such an agonizing thing. And he said, but if you take it out of the realm of academia, where it's just meant to be a brain teaser, but you take it into the real world, if we believe that letting 100 people die is like killing one person, then if we know that we could save 100 people today by sending money to a place where people are starving, then we have an obligation to do it.
So his depression, you talk about it very frankly in the book, was evolving, and it had ebbs and flows. Before he died, was it at its height? Was there a sense that it had at least crescendoed in a way that was concerning?
Well, he struggled for depression for several years. He struggled with it. He had a couple of different doctors who were very good, and medication which never quite, did the trick. Well, the odd thing about it, and this is something I do write about, the odd thing is that his depression and his decision did not manifest at all like the kind of depression we'd seen before. He did not seem sad or morose or down. He did not express feelings of despondency to us in any way. And he wasn't acting like that. He was acting very normal, and this is one of the great regrets I have, that I should have known, because he was acting so normal, that something was awry. He was acting, ordinarily he was just the most ebullient, funny, cheerful, outrageous, zany person you could ever meet. He was life of the party, and it wasn't that, but he wasn't acting depressed. And, since we've heard from a lot of people about a lot of different things, and one of the things we've heard about is in people who have decided to do this kind of determination and this kind of calculating precision and this strenuous effort not to let anybody know what's going on with them. So people should be aware of that. And, of the many things I condemn myself for, one of them is not using the word suicide more frequently and just more casually and liberally. We should have talked about it.
And I think it's a great act of generosity that you've been as honest as you are, not just for those close to you, but for many of us who've had people close to us who struggle with this. I want to delve a little more into the idea of naming the word suicide, and that there's sort of an impulse not to say it because it reifies it somehow. Can you just address?
Well, I think there's just this superstitious hunch that, well, if I say it, it's going to hover out there, it's going to make it more likely. It's like going to cast a spell on the future, and I think it's probably much closer to the reverse. If you don't talk about something that would naturally or should naturally be spoken of, you invest it with a kind of aura and mystery and power that it shouldn't have. And I say it's kind of like not talking to a teenager about sex. You know, as a parent, you might think that's slick, but it's not very slick, you know, and it's going to come up and it's a real issue. And so, you know, and I say in the book, there are two words that I very strongly regret not using much more in my ordinary vernacular, and one of them is suicide, and the other one is fascism.
You say, or write, I continue to arraign and prosecute myself for every sign, every clue I missed. And that is obviously hard to read, to imagine what that must be like to replay. But for those who, again, have gone through it, or what you now have learned, however long, and
well,
however
I've
much
come
distance.
to learn, like, that's not unusual for people who've, you know, gone through the kind of catastrophe that we've gone through. And that does lessen over time a lot. Because, I mean, I couldn't even talk about Tommy for months without crying. And you know, obviously I'm able to talk about him without crying now. And, we just miss him so sharply. I mean, that's the main emotion. And, you know, I'm glad I've been able to write about him and to keep his spirit and memory alive. We have this memorial fund that our daughters are running with cousins for Tommy, and they're doing great deeds and giving to the causes he believes in, Afghan rescue, earthquakes.
Is that for people who want to contribute? Is that in his name? Is it?
It's in Tommy's name, yeah. Yeah, because, you know, there was such an outpouring of emotion about it, and it's been a wonderful way to keep the younger generation together, talking about him, because when they come to talk about the grants, they're talking about Tommy's values, what would Tommy want, how would Tommy see this, and they're staying totally engaged with current events, and so we feel good about that.
I'm probably one of millions of people who wrote you without you knowing who we were when you wrote a tribute to him, and your family chose to make a statement that was exquisite, also included his last words in his letter. Can you, I'm sure if you're comfortable.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the last thing that Sarah and I see every night before we go to sleep, and the first thing we see in the morning because it's on our dresser. It was his farewell note. And it said, please forgive me, my illness won today. Look after each other, the animals, and the global poor for me. All my love, Tommy.
That's beautiful. So sorry.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that you then crashed into January 6th. And you could have not gone that day. I think your family asked you not to go. Can you describe just the decision to actually show up back at work?
I mean, I had several conversations with different people in our family about it, but Tabitha's is the one I remember most because she was most emphatic. You know, she just said, don't go, we don't want you to go. And I said, you know, Tabitha, it's in the Constitution, it's in the 12th Amendment, where the House and the Senate meet in joint session the first Wednesday in the first week of January after the presidential election. And, you know, I'd been getting ready for a few months to prepare to refute the bogus objections that were about to be lobbed against Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, a number of states, and I had been preparing in detail based on federal and state court litigation.
And before you move from that, Nancy Pelosi asked you, please imagine every contingency that could possibly be thrown at us. And she did that because you were a constitutional law professor. Was that something, were you literally running to ground any far-flung possibility of how they could possibly overturn the election?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was on the Democratic leadership team when the speaker said, we've got to get ready for this, and she had asked me specifically to think about the constitutional dimension and how we're going to refute and rebut these arguments. So I'd been getting ready for that, and I'd been, talking to people, including Tommy, about that whole process, to my colleagues in the House and lawyers and so on, and former professors and students and stuff. So that was one thing. I felt like I had to go because it was a constitutional duty, but also we were in the midst of COVID-19 and people were dropping like flies, and every day we were hearing about another member who couldn't come in, and we have very narrow margins in the House. Right now, I can't remember, I think someone else was just sworn in, so we're either at 4 or 5 right now. We have a 4 or 5 vote margin, but anything could have happened, and we live closer to the Capitol than any other member of Congress. I drive to work, I just go down North Capitol Street, so I just felt I had to go, but I said anybody who wants to come can come, and I'll arrange to do that, even though the staff were being told not to come because of COVID, and most people were not bringing their families. But Tabitha decided to come, and our son-in-law, Hank, who's married to our older daughter, Hannah, well, he had just married her. They had eloped in the summer, and that's a different problem. But they had eloped in the summer. But anyway, they had decided both to come. And so they were with me on that day. And Tabitha had said, will it be safe? Donald Trump is asking for his followers to come. And I said, I may have paused for a second, but I said, yeah, we'll be safe. We'll be in the Capitol building. And I had a very specific image from June the 2nd, which was the day after. Do you remember when Black Lives Matter was in Lafayette Square and Donald Trump and Attorney General Barr basically unleashed a paramilitary police riot on the protesters with, mace and horseback and swinging batons and everything? The next day, Black Lives Matter came to the Capitol, and there was just a huge contingent of National Guardsmen and women who were on the steps of the Capitol with their bayonets and their guns, and they were standing shoulder to shoulder. And that was the image that I had, and I said, we'll be safe. I mean, it just kind of flashed into my mind, and I said, everything will be all right, and they came down.
So I know we don't have time for every step of this, but it was, even having watched it and read everything, it was fairly chilling to hear your account of how it unfolded. Can you just give us a sense of just kind of in real time of when you began to realize how serious this was?
Well, as we drove down that day, there were signs. There were tons of protesters coming in, and people giving us the finger and yelling at us and stuff. And I remember seeing one bumper sticker on a car which said, "If guns are outlawed, how am I going to shoot liberals?" So there was a little tough rhetoric, but we were safe getting into the Capitol, and the kids were up in the gallery when I was, speaking, and I engaged in the debate. And when I got up, there was a very warm reception when I thanked everyone for their kindness and their sympathy and flowers and so on. And everybody stood up and started clapping, and I was so taken aback. I was seized with this kind of fantastical notion, maybe because we lost Tommy, it's not going to be so bad today. Maybe they'll let all of this go about contending that Donald Trump won the election. Maybe we'll just put all this behind us. But it was, it was an illusion. And then Tabitha and Hank left, and 20 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Pandemonium, telling us to put on gas masks, people bearing the Confederate battle flag, breaking into Statuary Hall, pictures of the officers being assaulted and bloodied and so on. And Tabitha and Hank were hiding under a desk in Steny Hoyer's office, and they had locked the door. They had pushed all the furniture up against the door. The mob was pounding on the door and, chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and "We want Trump." And Tabitha talks about how she was hiding under the desk, and the desk had one of those little holes that they have for the wires to come down, and she was trying to figure out a way to block that in case they broke into the office. They thought they were going to die, and people were calling their loved ones, their parents, their kids to say goodbye. Members of Congress were taking off the little pins that we wear to get in the building so they would lessen the chances of being recognized.
And some were crossing the aisle because they thought that if there was a mass shooting, they would shoot the Democrat.
In the House, as in most parliaments around the world, like the liberal progressive parties sit to well, from your perspective, sitting to the left of the dais, and the conservatives to the right, so the GOP was on that side, the Democrats on this side, and that side was filled with Democratic members because we were down here and we were respecting the COVID-19 protocol of every 2 seats have to be vacant. You're sitting in the 3rd seat. So the overflow Democrats were sitting up in the gallery. The GOP didn't respect that, and a lot of them weren't wearing masks, and so they were sitting right next to each other, not wearing masks, and there was nobody up on their side. So the people up on our side, when they began to pound and break down the doors, and people were seeing the footage of the Capitol being overrun because more than 900 people entered without going through the metal detectors or having any security screening at all, the people up there felt very exposed. And of course, the first thing you think about in the wake of Newtown, Connecticut, and the Pulse nightclub, and the Tree of Life Synagogue, and El Paso, Texas, and everything, you think somebody's going to bring in an assault weapon, and so they began to crawl from one side to the other because they thought there would be less chance that they would be shot if they were on that side of the aisle than if they were on that side.
And Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, who has served in the military, was helping people learn how to use a gas mask. You said you didn't even know that there were gas masks.
No, but most of us didn't know we had gas masks. The speaker was escorted out. The leadership of both the Democrats and Republicans was escorted out. And then there was a lot of screaming. I had Democratic colleagues who were yelling at the Republicans, "You did this. This is because of you." People were screaming back and forth. Then I heard the most haunting sound I will never forget, which was of people trying to barrel in through the central door of the House of Representatives, and people rushed over to try to fortify the door, and then we were all told to get back by Capitol officers who came in with their guns drawn. But you could hear the people yelling, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." And then we were finally all evacuated. It would have been, again, if this were the House, in that direction through the Speaker's lobby, and over this side is where the mob was at that point, and that's where the shooting was. And
so this
a
is
woman lost her life.
What is now called the legitimate political discourse.
Yeah, well, there were 3 rings of seditious activity on that day, and one was the mass demonstration, the wild demonstration called by the president on social media that tens of thousands of people responded to, and there was just a mixture of people there. Some thought maybe it would be like, Dr. King's March on Washington. Some thought it was going to be violent. That was a mixture, but it became a mob riot, and 150 of our officers were wounded or injured, broken necks, broken jaws, broken ribs, broken vertebrae, broken arms, gouged eyes, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Dozens of these people were absolute heroes who were overwhelmed by the numbers of people who were bearing steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, Trump flags, US flags. I saw somebody being speared with an American flag. So that was the outer ring. The middle ring was the ring of the insurrection, which was somewhere around a couple thousand people who belonged to domestic violent extremist groups who were recruited and brought to Washington, who coordinated their activity. It was the Proud Boys, who you will recall were told to stand back and stand by the then president at the first presidential debate.
The Oath Keepers?
The Oath Keepers, who've been charged with seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government. The Three Percenters, the Aryan Nations, the militia groups, and these are not official recognized militias, these are self-proclaimed militia groups. The QAnon network, which was very powerful on that day, the Unification Church, some other religious cults, Christian white nationalist groups that were there. And so that band, I don't know exactly how many people were in there, but it was a couple thousand. It was far larger than it had been when they had first assembled in Charlottesville, Virginia, to unite the right in August of 2017. They had grown, they'd quadrupled or quintupled their size, and they had been catapulted to a completely different level of fame and power because they were the frontline stormtroopers of an attack of 40 or 50,000 people that came, and they were the band that smashed our windows, broke down our doors, and began the violent assault against the officers, and then entered determined to shut down the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in U.S. history, and they succeeded in doing it. And if you read their websites in the middle of the night or the next day or over the next couple of weeks, they bragged about it. They were thrilled about it. It will be a great day, as Donald Trump told them it would be a day forever remembered. And they condemned themselves only for not having brought their guns with them, leaving their guns in the cars in the hotels or motels. And the reason they did that was to get into the Trump rally because the Secret Service were checking to make sure they didn't have firearms, which is why they left them at that point. And why most of them, some people did have knives and firearms, but most of them didn't when they got there, which is why they were using those other instruments and the mace and the tear gas and so on. And
you have not, in your book, you do not make the threat to you a major focus, but many asked you if you were afraid, and I just want to read a section from your book. The very worst thing that could ever have happened to us had already happened. And Tommy was with me somehow every step of the way. He is occupying my heart. He is showing me the way to some kind of safety. My wound has now become my shield of defense and my path to escape, and all I can think of is my son propelling me forward to fight. I was very angry. I didn't feel any fear for myself. I did not. And I was very concerned about Tabitha and Hank and Julie Tagan, my chief of staff, who was with them. But yeah, I felt Tommy in my heart and my chest. I still do, every day. I didn't tell you about that final ring, which is the most important one, which is the ring of the coup. And it's an odd word in the American political lexicon because we don't have a lot of experience with coups in our own country. And we think of a coup as something that takes place against a president, and this was a coup orchestrated by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. And you know that Donald Trump could read the polls like everyone else, and he knew that he was going to lose the election, and yet he wanted to ready his followers for an attack on the election. And he repeatedly said, for months and weeks before the election, the only way I can lose is if they steal this election, if it's a scam. And then after the election took place, he got up and then began to spread the big lie, saying we were on our way to winning until in the middle of the night, they brought in some votes. In fact, we did win the election. And he never backed down from that. And that was the big lie. And then that's when they began the attack on the election with tactics of escalating illegitimacy. I mean, it began with what every American has a right to do, which is to sue. So they brought 60 different lawsuits, all of which ended up with a definitive pronouncement by the court that there was no electoral fraud and there was no electoral corruption. We have a comprehensive, detailed record refuting and rejecting every allegation that has been made about electoral fraud or corruption, but that didn't stop them. That just started
the process. And but by the way, that included 8 judges that Donald Trump himself nominated to the federal bench. He lost even in the courts of my judges, right? As he put it.
But Congressman, before you go into, I know you can mention also the intimidation of Raffensperger, which you talk about, but I just want to push back a little bit on the word coup, because I think some people react to it with with a little bit of the hyperbole of it. Their reaction is that really an appropriate word to use here? And can you actually say that that was something that the president was engineering? I just want to make sure that you're using that word very deliberately and helping those people who say that it is histrionic. Yeah. How do you respond to them?
Well, I mean, I address the use of the words in the book, but it's a very specific political science term to describe this situation. It's what the political scientists call a self-coup, where you have someone who's in office, who is about to be ousted from office, who engineers an attempt to overthrow the normal constitutional process. And you know, when they tried everything else, they tried to intimidate the election officials, 30 of them, not just Brad Raffensperger. That was the famous one because it was caught on tape, where he said to Raffensperger, "I'm just telling you to find me 11,780 votes. That's all I want." I mean, I'm a politician, that's all I want, 11,780 votes. Find me that many votes. He wasn't trying to stop election fraud, he was trying to commit election fraud. And he was caught red-handed doing it, which is why the prosecutors in Georgia are going after him for that right now. Then they had a whole plan to seize the electoral machinery and have the military rerun the election, but they couldn't get the Department of Homeland Security or DOJ or the armed services to go along with that. So they ended up with this. We're going to tell the Vice President of the United States to declare heretofore unknown powers that are not in the Constitution to unilaterally reject Electoral College votes coming in from 3 states specifically, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And we're going to concoct phony electoral slates, fraudulent, counterfeit slates. We're going to send them in. The Vice President, all you've got to say is there's some mystery here. I'm going to send them back. I'm going to return them to the legislatures to decide, as if that's some kind of constitutional process, which it's not. And then once he does that, what happens? Well, Joe Biden loses his Electoral College majority. So he was at 306, and it would have taken him below 270. And what happens if no one has a majority in the Electoral College? Well, under the 12th Amendment, it's kicked immediately into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election. Now, why would Donald Trump want Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic majority in the House to be deciding the presidential election? Well, they knew under the 12th Amendment, and this is what John Eastman's memo is about, that we don't vote one member, one vote. We vote one state, one vote. And so after the 2020 elections, there were 27 state delegations in the House controlled by the GOP. We, the Democrats, have 22. And one state, Pennsylvania, split right down the middle, 9 representatives on each side, so they would have been taken off the playing field. Even had they suffered the defection of my new best friend, the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, as I think they would have had 26 states in the bag. They would have run it very quickly, like the Republican National Convention. They would have said 26 to 22 or 23, Donald Trump is president. They would have invoked the Insurrection Act, which is what his disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn had been urging him to do, which the president, by all accounts, public accounts, was very interested in doing. He would have declared something like martial law, probably would have called in the National Guard at that point to put down the insurrectionary chaos that he had unleashed against us to make himself the hero. You know, Speaker Pelosi couldn't protect you against all of this Antifa-inspired chaos, they would have said, but I brought in the National Guard and did it. I mean, if that's not a coup, I don't know what a coup is.
I just want to observe the passion with which you just delivered that, and note that there are many, and you've seen this, who were outraged, horrified by January 6th, but are sort of worn down now, feel exhausted by the Trump era, want to get past it. how do you actually address the fatigue of outrage in this country? In some sense, it's its own cudgel, isn't it? It's sort of either defangs or we want to opt out and watch Yellowstone.
Well, watch Yellowstone or take a nap or go to synagogue or, go for a run, whatever it is, and then come right back and get impassioned about it again, because the whole democracy's on the line right now. And we're not done with this thing remotely. We're in the middle of a struggle to defend democracy, and not just in the United States, all over the world. And every autocrat, dictator, bully, despot, from Vladimir Putin, the ringleader, to Orban in Hungary, or Duterte in the Philippines, or El Sisi in Egypt, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Donald Trump, in Florida, you name it, all of them are rooting for the victory of authoritarianism, an authoritarian invasion of Ukraine to overthrow that fledgling democracy, authoritarianism in America to overthrow the world's greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious democracy that's ever existed, and they're trying to destroy us as an example to the rest of the world, and a democracy that can fight for human rights and defend democracy in other parts of the world. And if we let Putin get away with it in Ukraine, well, then it'll be China in Taiwan or Hong Kong next, or who knows where it goes. We'll be back to the 19th century. So this is very serious business we're involved in, and if I'm passionate about it, it's because January 6th is as close to fascism as I ever want my constituents, my family, or my country to come, ever again.
And that charge to us, it is echoed in your book. You actually quote, I think it's Pirkei Avot, you are not required to complete the work, but nor can you desist from it. That came through all through your book, is that there is this sense that the work has to continue. Many kept asking you, how are you doing it? How are you just physically, emotionally showing up for this? You write that Nancy Pelosi, in a sense, threw you a lifeline when she put you in charge of the impeachment trial. Can you now shift into that chapter? Well,
I wasn't eating very well. I wasn't sleeping. And we were in the depths of our despondency. And we lost Tommy on Wednesday, December 31st, 2020. 1 week later, Wednesday, January 6th, was the violent insurrection, the day after we buried Tommy at a closed COVID-19 restricted family service, which was a very, very dark, gloomy day, as you can imagine, for us. But 1 week after January 6th, the 13th, was the day that we impeached Donald Trump for inciting a violent insurrection. And we also voted to call upon Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to say that the president was not capable of successfully executing the powers and duties of his office, and the vice president should take over for the remaining 3 weeks of or 2 weeks at that point of the presidency. But when the speaker asked me that, I was such a wreck. The reason I say that in hindsight she was throwing me a lifeline is because she was saying, we need you. And you got to mobilize and you got to fight.
Your team for impeachment was its own kind of amazing phenomenon, and your direction to them was very much not to speechify for its own sake. No lectures about the Federalist Papers. Tell a story. We're going to tell a story. Why was that so important to you? And if you could address the Hollywood director's offer to help you make that film that we all watch or should have watched. Is it 13 minutes? That's so difficult to watch, of kind of the montage of anarchy and a coup, as you said. But there were many who swooped in and said, we can produce this for you, and you flat out rejected those offers. So if you could address those two.
Okay, well, so there were not a lot of people in the Senate who were really excited about another impeachment trial. And nor was Chief Justice John Roberts, who constitutionally, arguably should have been there for it, but decided to sit that one out. Most Senates never hear a presidential impeachment trial, and this Senate was going to hear 2 of them against the same guy. So they weren't thrilled about it, and they felt like there had been, that they'd been lectured to a little bit, that there'd been some speechifying, that,
You're not going to be critical of the first team.
No, I thought they did an amazing job, but no, I thought that I thought he was guilty. They convinced me. They convinced me absolutely that he did it. And of course, I had voted for impeachment. But the Ukraine shakedown was a prelude not just to what they did to us on January 6th, but to what's happening in Ukraine today. Right. Ukraine is just going to be a political plaything for authoritarian superpowers and wannabe autocrats all over the world. It's
but you're saying that people who are watching have just been through this.
They just felt exhausted by it. They felt exhausted by it. And so it was very clear to me. I said, if we're going to do this successfully, we've got basically 3 weeks or 4 weeks to research and find out everything that happened to the extent we could. Now understand, our charge was far more limited than the charge of the January 6th Select Committee today, which is charged with describing all of the events and all of the causes, and then making recommendations about how to fortify our democratic institutions going forward. At the point of the Senate trial, it was about, did Donald Trump incite a violent insurrection against the Union? And so we had to bear down, collect all the evidence, and then put it into a coherent, comprehensible story. And I said, we're not getting up making speeches like we do on the floor where everybody's got their own agenda. We're telling one story from start to finish where we're just passing the baton to each other, and we're going to integrate our legal argumentation about nonsense that they're going to throw at us, like about the First Amendment or due process. We're going to integrate that into our presentation so we don't have, Professor Raskin's constitutional law seminar in the Senate, which is what they were all afraid of. So.
And the video offers.
And we wanted to use all of the video and all of the photography, all of the emails and the texts that we could to make it come alive. See, here was the thing you got to understand, that the senators were in the Senate, the members of the House were in the House, and although it was traumatizing enough to go through what we had gone through, we didn't see a fraction of what was taking place. We didn't understand the waves of medieval violence that were raining down on the officers outside. That was one of the bloodiest and most violent things ever to happen, maybe the bloodiest and most violent thing ever to happen at the U.S. Capitol. Nothing like that ever took place during the Civil War. Nobody had ever seen a mob riot explode like that, followed by a violent insurrection in order to surround, I'm going to use the word again, a coup against the U.S. government. And that's what was taking place. And so we needed to tell that story. It wasn't just the discomfort that the senators experienced having to be escorted from the chamber in this, rude and unruly way. It wasn't just that the insurrectionists took over the Senate and put their feet up on the desks and rifled through their papers and stole stuff. That was a trivial part of what had taken place, but they didn't see the rest of it. So we had to tell them that story. And when we put together that 13-minute video, I'd been getting calls from all of these like Hollywood producers or directors saying, I would really love to come in and put this together for you. And they were totally, sincerely, honestly motivated. And I said, that would be fantastic as a creative matter to help us package all of this, but it would be an absolute disaster politically, because then that's all that they would need to say about this, that this was a made for Hollywood TV movie. And so I said, thank you, but no thank you. And, we'll stick with our paralegals and our legal staff and the people, who put it together. And, it didn't need any fancy editing or anything. It was absolutely gruesome and gory. And most of the senators watched it. Some of them, to their everlasting shame, refused to watch it. I mean, I saw Ted Cruz not looking at it. I saw Marco Rubio not looking at it. I saw Josh Hawley not looking at it. Or, if they would glance up, they were, taking these bitter little notes like they're seeing some Antifa conspiracy in the background or something. Yeah. But most of them were spellbound. And I think I saw Senator McConnell even cry a couple of times, which is why, it led me to believe that maybe still we were going to win this thing, even though everybody was saying this is going to be a 50-50 result. Maybe you get Romney again, but you're not going to get any Republicans to break ranks.
We're going to go to some questions, and I'm going to be a bit of a taskmaster to try to keep you concise, because we have a bunch of them.
Forgive me.
They're good.
I was a senator once in Maryland, so I know how to filibuster. So,
Lisa's asking, has your faith in our democracy been impacted by all your experiences over the past year plus?
Well, our electoral institutions, our political institutions are rickety. They're antiquated in some ways. The Electoral College is an antique. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars exporting democracy every year to go and teach people about elections and how to have democracy. And one thing they never do is say, that Electoral College system you have sounds really good. We'll take that. We're not exporting the Electoral College, and it's time for us to get out of that. The very first bill I introduced as a state senator back in 2007 was for a national popular vote, and we have a national popular vote interstate compact going, but it's slow going now as it's become a partisan thing. But the gerrymandering of our congressional districts, the filibuster, this is what we're up against. The vast majority of the country rejects Trumpism. The vast majority of the country rejects coups and insurrections and violent assault on our political institutions. But the problem is there's a bag of tricks that's being used against us, like the gerrymandering of our districts, like the use of the filibuster to stop voting rights legislation, like the voter suppression statute. So we've got to deal with that. But I'm with John Dewey, who said the only solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy, because what we're suffering from is these anti-democratic devices and instruments. That's what's hurting us today. But the will of the majority is in favor of democracy and human rights here and in Ukraine and all over the world. I've got no doubt about that. So my faith in democracy is vindicated every single day by the people I encounter and the emails I get and the letters I get about how we need to stand up and fight. And I am going to continue to fight with everything I've got for this democracy.
Thank you. As citizens, it is easy to feel powerless and dispirited by the news. As a congressman, how do you experience events such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine? How do you respond in your professional and personal capacity?
I mean, I'm mad about it. I'm furious about it. I mean, there are doctors who will tell you that depression is repressed anger, in some, when it's not a clinical depression. So don't get depressed. This is a strategy. I mean, who wants you to be depressed and anxious, and who wants you to be cynical and jaded? Well, Vladimir Putin does, and Donald Trump does. That's a strategy. Don't fall for that. Get up. People need to get up and fight back against this. And I'm talking to the majority here. The vast majority. And every time Jim Jordan says to me, well, you don't think that you guys are going to steal an election from 74 million people, do you? I say, you don't think you're going to steal an election from 81 million people, do you? Because it's the majority that won the election in 2020. And it's been vindicated in the courts by the rule of law, which is how we do it in a constitutional democracy. It's been decided by the House and the Senate on a bipartisan majority. And the champion of the big lie, who is their cult master, has lost in the House and the Senate, both in the election and in the impeachment and conviction, in robust bipartisan bicameral majorities. 57 to 43 which was the vote to convict Donald Trump, is the most sweeping bipartisan result in American history in a presidential impeachment trial. There have only been 4 of them: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, for you know what, and Donald Trump 1 and Donald Trump 2. And the most sweeping verdict was 57-43. So that's something that they're proud of. That's a badge of shame that he's got to wear, being the only twice impeached president in American history. And it's a double badge of shame for people who continue to follow him to this day.
Jamie, you've let me call you Jamie, so I may interrupt you sometimes.
Go for it.
After watching your amazing leadership throughout the impeachment trial, it is hard to think of anything you or your team could have done differently in the trial. Now that time has passed, thinking back, is there anything you feel you could have done differently that would have had a different outcome?
Oh, I couldn't sleep for several weeks afterwards, replaying everything we did and all the decisions we made. There were a couple of motions I wanted to bring, pre-trial motions, which I didn't because we were warned away from it by our friends in the Senate. And one I really regret, which was just to change the seating arrangements, because whoever heard of a criminal prosecution, this was not criminal, this was civil, but whoever heard of a jury in a criminal case or a civil case sitting according to political party? So I said it shouldn't be the Republicans here and the Democrats here. Let's just do it alphabetically, or let's do it randomly, so they can put on the thinking caps of jurors, because they swear an independent oath, a new oath, not just their oath to uphold the Constitution, which they swore when they got, when they first were brought into the Senate, but they swore another oath to render an impartial verdict. So, but we were told, well, they're already upset because people were rifling through their belongings, and the senators are quite attached to their desks. They don't want to move to a different place and so on. And I really wish I had pushed that. And, and there were some people who thought that we should be pushing for a secret ballot because of all the death threats and violent threats that were in the air there. So I replay that sometimes. But if you're interested, I do answer that question in more detail in the book.
I'm just combining a few here. Some are asking about is it 187 minutes or 2 hours plus that Donald Trump did not act or do anything in response to what was unfolding in front of him. And someone is asking, in companion question to this, do you think there will be any consequences for Donald Trump's actions?
Well, yes, as a proud member of the bipartisan select committee on the January 6th attacks, I will tell you, we are going to deliver a painstaking and comprehensive report to the American people and to Congress about what happened. And we are going to lay it all out there. And so I urge you to stay tuned for the hearings that are coming probably in April or May, and then the report that we're going to issue to the country. And I should say this is the most bipartisan committee I've ever been on, because we don't spend an hour in partisan invective and polemic every day when we begin our committee hearings. We actually go right to trying to do the work of the committee, which is to get to the facts.
Ukraine is obviously a whole other night conversation, but a couple are asking, what, if you were President Biden, what do you think the response should be?
Well, I like what President Biden has been doing and saying about this. We need to unify the democratic world against this atrocity. I mean, this is one nation waging aggressive war against another nation, totally in violation of international law, violating the independent national sovereignty of Ukraine. And Ukraine is not a province of Russia. It's not the property of Russia. It doesn't belong to Vladimir Putin. And when he gets up and he says, oh, well, we're going to go in to defend ethnic Russians in Ukraine, this is nothing, to my mind, other than a distinct historical echo of Hitler saying he's going to go into Czechoslovakia to save ethnic Germans. I mean, that's an authoritarian, fascist fraud of an argument. So I think we need to stick together, and we need to understand it's not just the democracy of Ukraine that's under attack today. It's all the democracies, and the democratic governments and peoples and movements have got to stick together strong.
To shift gears here, can you talk a bit about your thoughts on if or how legislation can address the mental health crisis in our country? Thank you, Lizzie, for this question.
Well, there's so much that we can do, that we must do. There's some bills that I'm co-sponsoring and working on today to give the Department of Health and Human Services a budget for supporting states and local governments to get money into schools at all levels, elementary schools, high schools, college level, because we need a lot more counselors. We know that there is a national crisis in emotional and mental health today, and we are in a society that has been defined by trauma over the last few years. We've lost more than 900,000 people to COVID-19. We lost comparable numbers in the opioid crisis. We've got the emotional and mental health crisis itself. We've got gun violence. I mean, it's just a nightmare out there for people. So we need to be surging aid into the schools and our communities, many of which are just vastly understaffed. There are entire counties that don't have a pediatric psychiatrist in the country, and so we need to deal with this. At the federal level, theoretically, we've got mental health parity, that there's supposed to be equally available resources in mental health and in physical health, but it's a promise that's been honored in the breach. So this is now an issue, thankfully, which is getting bipartisan attention and investment, and I'm hoping that very soon we will be able to get a number of these bills passed. And also, we're investing in a new hotline for people who are in crisis around the country.
How, if at all, does your Judaism affect your philosophy of governance?
Well, I write some about this too, but I don't know. I mean, for me, it all begins with, if I'm not for myself, who will be? But if I am for myself only, who am I? If not now, when? I mean, it doesn't get much better than that, to my mind. So, for me, growing up Jewish meant identification with the underdog, because we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and we are told never to forget that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, which means you've got to look around the world today and see who are the slaves. And then those are the people that we have to express fundamental solidarity with most urgently.
Can you share with us what you do to get through the most difficult days? Do you pray? Do you talk to someone? Do you take a walk? Do you meditate? Well,
thank you. It's a sweet message. My father always used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. So I grew up with that sense of responsibility, but I've gone on hikes for a long time, and I love to go on hikes, and Sarah and Tommy and the girls and I, we go on, we've gone on hikes as a family for a long time. I think there's a picture of us in my book on a hike together. So that helps a lot. So I try all of that stuff, but probably I derive the most strength being an extroverted person from other people, and from talking to people, and from hearing about their experiences. And we've had thousands and thousands of people reach out to our family to help take care of us and tell us about what they've gone through and how they've done it. And we've heard from, equal numbers of people about standing strong for democracy wherever they live. And there are people who live in places much tougher than Tacoma Park, Maryland. I mean, there are people all over America who are standing up as constitutional patriots. And some of them are Republicans, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and some of them are Democrats, and some of them are independents and Greens and libertarians. To me, it's not a partisan thing. Constitutional patriotism is for everybody.
I want to take a moderator's prerogative and just ask you, on that note of healing, Dara Williams is a friend of your family. She's a singer-songwriter that's one of my favorites. in the book, you told her about an Amish quilt, or you discussed this idea of an Amish quilt, or maybe it's an actual physical one or a metaphor. But I would love you to end by just describing how that was a comfort. Do you remember part of your book?
Yeah, Sarah will tell you I'm a big quilt person. I love quilts, and one of our friends, Jennifer Lord, who is a very close family friend and a Republican fundamentalist Christian from Texas, who I think is coming to visit us this week. She made us a quilt from Tommy's shirts. So we have that quilt, and it's a beautiful thing and our prized possession. But someone told me that a family can be viewed as like a succession of generations, but a family could also be viewed like a quilt, and each person is a patch on the quilt. And, you might be alive or you might no longer be alive, but you're still on the quilt.
Thank you, Congressman Raskin.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.